All right, sound check 1, 2, 3. All right, sound check 1, 2, 3. All right, sound check 1, 2, 3. Sound of absent-minded clicking. All right, let's get rid of that infinity shot there. Away. There we go. Oh, the fun of virtual learning is that everybody is learning the technology together. So Kind of a small lecture room this time. I've certainly spoken to smaller ones, but for the benefit of people coming in, welcome, hello. Welcome, hello. Thanks for coming up to our virtual talk today. I hope everyone is safe. I hope everyone is healthy. And I hope everybody's making the most of it in these rough times now. These are normal circumstances, not by any stretch. And so all we can sometimes do is just make it to the weekend. And I am here to tell you that you did make it to Friday. We can at least, the thing that's been keeping me going through this week is knowing that Friday was going to be the day I'm talking. And if I'm talking now, it must mean today is Friday because otherwise time seems to have absolutely no meaning. Welcome everybody. My name is Kevin Impellizzeri. I'm a museum educator as my regular profession, but I also recently completed a doctorate in history at the University of Delaware. And my PhD dissertation covered a cultural history of home video games in America from 1972 to 1994, focusing specifically on what did it mean to own, what did it mean to use video games, who and what was a video game user during those first 2 decades of the video game industry, and how did that then change over time? How did we get to this idea of a gamer? And also, what did it mean to have video games in a household, and what did it mean for sort of larger culture that video games come around? These are kind of the formative decades of video gaming. And one of the things I covered in the latter part of my dissertation was this idea of video game ratings. And so I decided that, the walls are kind of closing in, that we need some way to connect, even though social distancing is super, super important. There's a great benefit to emotional connections. They're more important now than they were ever, I'd say. And so I decided, why not take our mind off what's going on, all of this, and I don't know, talk about video games. Let's talk about when we used to worry about something else. And so this is the first part of what's going to be a multi-part series I'm calling This Isn't Pac-Man Anymore. And we're going to focus on the 1993 moral panic over video games. Ultimately, what our big question is going to be, so what we're going to explore is, how did video games get ratings? And so for those who are uninitiated, video games have a rating system known as the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, or the ESRB. It was created in 1994 by what was then called the Interactive Digital Software Association, or the known today as the ESA, the Entertainment Software Association. And the ESRB, the idea of it was to assign a letter-based rating to all video game content that was commercially released, based on an age group. And I've got the listings here from early childhood, or EC, to E for everyone, everyone 10 plus, T for teen, M, AO, and when things aren't rated and are being examined by the ESRB, they get this RP rating, or ratings pending. So this has been in place since 1994. And the idea of this was something like what the film industry has, where basically it's assigned a rating that says who's this age appropriate for. It was supposed to also help establish who retailers could sell games to. So my big question that we're going to examine, and in fact, here's some examples of ESRB ratings. So the ESRB has to appear on all packaging, it has to appear on all advertising, and it has to appear on the physical media which games are played. So these are examples of a couple of them. We got Dark Souls 3 with an M rating in the bottom left corner of the game package. I have in the middle a N64 copy of Wayne Gretzky 3D Hockey 98, which has the now defunct K to A rating, or Kids to Adults rating. And on the right, the classic Super Smash Brothers Melee, which, as you can see on its disc, had a T for teen rating. These are just kind of the first games that came off my shelf. And I wanted to have a KA rating, so I have it there. And game ratings must also appear on all advertisements. And so this is an example from a magazine that I pulled off my shelf, which is from when Grand Theft Auto Vice City, before it came out. It's an ad for GTA Vice City, and if you'll notice in the on the left panel in the bottom right corner, you have that RP, that rating, pending rating, which shows that this is before the game was released. So what I wanted to examine in this is our big question, which is, how did video games get age labels? Why are video games rated? How did that come to be? Video games have been around commercially in the United States since 1972. Why then did it take till 1994 for them to get ratings? And it's kind of an interesting story, and kind of a long story too. Hence this multi-part series that I'm calling "This Isn't Pac-Man Anymore," the 1993 moral panic over video games. Hello to those who are just coming in now. So the short answer to this big question is that the creation of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board was the culmination of a moral panic over video games, and particularly video game violence and the depictions of video game content, such as violent content, depictions of sexuality in games, that led to a series of congressional investigations and hearings that talked about video games and took the industry to task about what was going on in video games and what was being presented in games. And ultimately, lawmakers, as well as panels of child psychologists and academics, media watchdogs, and other experts, demanded that the industry regulate itself, lest the government do it for them. So that's the short answer. But we're going to cover the long answer over the course of this series, and talk about this moral panic, and talk about how video games got ratings. So this is the way things are going to be mapped out. And I'm going to release an episode once every week, same time every week, Fridays, tentatively right now, Fridays 4 p.m., with that scheduled for as long as we are still in COVID quarantine. Although if restrictions are lifted, if this menace starts to pass, and larger things start to change, I will change the date of it. But for those of you who cannot make it on Fridays at 4 p.m., fear not, because I will also be publishing the recorded episodes on my website and on my YouTube channel. You can check out the link to my website with the full map of the series, which you can check down in the description below, is also on the screen here. With our first one today covering what a moral panic is, part 2 covering video game panics before 1993, and then covering things like the virtual reality craze, FMV games, the crime panic, Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, 2 games in particular that were of interest during the panic, then the hearings themselves, and then lastly the legacy of the panic and the ESRB and what they have meant for video games going forward. So along the way, we have a couple of secondary questions that we're going to examine too, which are going to help color our understanding of this panic over video games and video game violence. So we're going to examine what the social, cultural, and technological factors that led to the panic over video games. And with that, examine what were anxieties over video games like before 1993 and 1994, before this moral panic in 93, and then what that means for after the hearings as well, and after the creation of the ESRB. And also, what was the industry up to? What was going on in video game history at this time? What were the popular titles? What were the big trends that were going on in video gaming? We're going to examine all of that as well. And then ultimately, what was the point of all this stuff? What's the legacy of the panic against video games that led to the creation of the ESRB? And what did those panics and the ESRB and video game ratings as a whole, how did they resonate into the present day? What does it mean now? What was the point of all of it? So that's what we're going to examine. over the course of it. Feel free to offer questions or comments in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on it, but I'll probably, for the most part, be answering questions at the end. But feel free to ask, feel free to interact with each other, feel free to shout out answers, all that stuff. It's hard to interrupt when I have it in the chat there. But I hope that we can kind of learn together, because I hope this will be a fun topic. So why don't we start out with the first part of this one? So what is a moral panic? I will let you know in advance that occasionally we'll have throughout this series content warnings, and this is our first of them because we are going to be discussing some tough topics, particularly focusing on discussion of violence and a specific focus on suicide in a little bit. So I think that to understand anything else and to understand the creation of the video game ratings board, the ESRB, we need to step back a second. I call this series the 1993 Moral Panic over video games. Now, so what we're going to focus on today is we're going to do some definitions, and we're going to ask that simple question: what is a moral panic? What characterizes a moral panic? What are some examples of moral panics throughout history? And what do moral panics, what's the bigger picture? What's the bigger point of them? Why should we focus on moral panics? And then this will help characterize our larger understanding of video games at this time. So this is where we get into a little bit of inside baseball, a little bit of the academic side of it. I'm going to try to keep theory relatively light, but it's important to see a little bit of where this came from. So this idea of a moral panic, this term moral panic, dates back to 1972 to a sociologist by the name of Stanley Cohen, who published a book called Folk Devils and Moral Panics, The Creation of the Mods and Rockers. And he introduced this idea of a cultural anxiety over a perceived threat. So here's our first key term. A moral panic, the definition that I'm going with, is a sudden backlash against a perceived threat to the moral order, the general impact of which is overstated or non-existent. So in some ways, an exaggerated reaction to a threat that it's ultimately not as significant a threat as the people arguing it are. So the people who, so that's our first key term we're going to go into. The second one is moral entrepreneurs. These are the people who wage moral panics. This is a term introduced in moral panic theory. And moral entrepreneurs, these can be lawmakers, they can be religious organizations, they can be teachers, they can be members of the media. They're the people who take on this specific threat or focus on this idea of this threat. And moral entrepreneurs identify and launch campaigns. They'll give press attention. They'll focus on this specific threat to what they see as a perceived threat to the moral order. And their targets are what they call a folk devil. It's a target of a moral panic that embodies concerns of moral decay, a specific threat to the moral order, and a specific threat to what is quote-unquote morally right in society. And moral entrepreneurs, when they find a folk devil, when they carry out moral panics, they usually have some idea that something has to be done about this. The moral fabric is tearing apart at the seams, and we need to find some way to help repair that. And oftentimes this involves things like regulation, increased laws that punish certain types of behaviors. In the cases of targets against the media, such as this image here, which I'll describe in a second, it can involve things like restriction and censorship. And so usually some kind of restriction against behavior. So I have on here an example of one of them. Show of hands, anyone who's heard of Jack Chick? I know a lot of people are watching, but I'll give a chance if anyone wants to share. All right, Jack Chick was an evangelical publisher who published a series of small pamphlets he called Chick Tracts, which were very small comics. They were about yay big. That is, fit in a pocket. And he mass produced these things, uh, advocating against various threats to what he thought for Christian morality, very specific aspect of evangelical Christianity. And he talked about he railed against a bunch of different threats. One popular one is rock music, and this is a part of a panel from one he did called Angels. What's interesting about this one is it's not just about heavy metal music. This one was also against Christian rock, arguing that Christian rock was a gateway into um, debauchery and the occult, and that even Christian aspects of rock and roll were a line too close for him for comfort. I will say also at the outset that Jack Chick was also editorializing here was also extremely intolerant of people who were not a very specific branch of Christianity, specifically the one he identified with. So he railed out against um, Muslims. He railed out against homosexuals. He railed against Catholics, so other Christians. In addition to these sort of moral vices, rock music, gaming, film, things like that. So, so moral panics. Again, this backlash to a perceived threat to the moral order. Moral entrepreneurs identify a specific target which they feel is detrimental enough to society that something needs to be done about it. But ultimately, the target they usually pick as their target usually does not have the kind of large scale impact they say it does, or the larger threat is not really there. I'll give you a broad example. Family values are declining. We need to restore family values. Well, then the question comes, what is family values? And what ways are they're in decline? And then what are those threats to moral values and things like that? So these are kind of our basic terms that we're going to go into. He would hate those megachurch bands. They're gateways to madness. So let's go into some characters. So this is Eric Good and Nachman Ben Yehuda, who are two moral panic scholars, summed it up a lot better than I can. This idea of a moral panic. They said during the moral panic, the behavior of some of the members of society is thought to be so problematic to others. The evil they do or thought to do is felt to be so wounding to the substance and fabric of the body social that serious steps must be taken to control the behavior, punish the perpetrators, and repair the damage. And they describe the response to it as a kind of fever, which they characterize by heightened emotion, fear, dread, anxiety, hostility, and a strong feeling of righteousness. And this idea that this horrible threat needs to be addressed now. It's almost in some cases an apocalyptic response to it. And so here's an example here we have in this image. This is a headline from the July 29, 2004 copy of the Daily Mail, which had this very provocative headline: "Murder by PlayStation. Horror images on computer drove teenager to kill his friend aged 14." So suggesting that this violent crime, that video games perpetuated this violent crime. Specifically, the game that targeted was the Rockstar game Manhunt. Show of hands, anybody who's played Manhunt. It's a name I haven't heard in a while. So the context of the story was that a 17-year-old named Warren LeBlanc murdered a 17-year-old boy named Stefan Pecura, and reports from the Daily Mail were blaming it on images he saw from Manhunt. However, the police who were investigating were pretty quick to refute this. They said there was no connection between Manhunt and the murder. And also, they later reported that the only copy of Manhunt that was involved in this entire case was a copy of Manhunt that was found at the 14-year-old Stefan Pakira's house, which then raised further questions of how had Stefan get a copy of this game. But so moral entrepreneurs will focus on something that probably doesn't have the impact that they're arguing. So let's get into a little bit more about what are the characteristics of a moral panic. What defines a moral panic? And this is something we're actually going to go back to numerous times throughout the series. Is Eric Good and Nachman Ben Yehuda offered 5 characteristics of a moral panic. They are concern, hostility, consensus, disproportionality, and volatility. So let's start with concern. We'll go briefly through all of them. So concern, they have this there's this heightened anxiety over some perceived threat to the moral order. Violence in society is way too high. There's a perception that there's a proliferation of drugs, too many drugs out there. Crack cocaine, heroin, whatever you want to pick. Video games are making people violent. There's this concern. Something is happening. Concern about violence, concern about the decline of family, things like that. And the response to that is a hostile response. That these responses to that perceived threat are negative and hostile. Moral panics are generally anti-movements, anti-violence, anti-suggestive rock and roll lyrics, anti-occult, anti-violent video games. Those are just some examples of that. Welcome to the people who were just jumping in. I see our numbers went up a little bit, which is great. But with this, there's also this what they describe as a consensus. So moral panics often have a unifying message about a specific threat that kind of crowds out any other. Moral panics don't really leave a lot of room for nuance. Going back to the violent video game example, video games are turning people violent. These violent, horrible depictions of murder and mayhem are desensitizing people to violence, and they're, by extension, turning people into people who perpetuate crimes. You can turn people into killers. So there's this consensus, this idea that needs to be addressed. It needs to be stopped. And you have somebody jump in and say something like, can we adjust? I can't see the current heading. Oh, I see why. It's because my ugly mug is in the middle of it. All right, it's going to, pardon for a moment, we're going to have a bit of an infinity shot here as I sit on my streaming thing here. And there we go. All better. All right, thanks for looking out. That should fix it a little bit. I appreciate the feedback. So the consensus, again, the various groups of individuals have a unified message about that threat that crowds out other ones. So we've got our concern, we've got our hostility, we've got our consensus. The fourth thing is an interesting one, which is a key element of examining moral panics, is this thing called disproportionality, which is that the specific threat is overstated. There's not maybe a connection to that. Or it's very possible that that threat doesn't actually exist. We're going to, for example, so moral panics are often sometimes pushed through media and focusing on a specific threat that may not have a big impact. And I'll give you a great example, which I'm going to go back to, Tide Pods. Does everyone remember everyone freaking out over Tide Pods? It's the latest viral horror. Teenagers are going on YouTube and they're eating Tide Pods and they're poisoning themselves and they're dying. And we need to do something about this horrible, horrible threat. And people are seeing people get lots of likes and views for eating Tide Pods. And then these impressionable youth are eating them and poisoning themselves and they're dying too. And it's this horrible plague of Tide Pods, this Tide Pod plague. It was all over the news. Rob Gronkowski became the spokesman for Tide Pods to tell people not to eat Tide Pods. So, but what was the actual? How many people were actually eating Tide Pods? And reports from the CDC at the time said uh, that it really wasn't impacting. People were not eating these things en masse, and most cases of people eating Tide Pods were usually very, very young children who got access to them and mistook them for candy and ate them by accident. And the number of people actually doing this thing that was focused on so much in the media was so disproportionate to the actual impact it was having. We're going to see another couple of examples of some disproportionate, and in one case, a non-existent panic, where people were panicking over the specific thing, and it wasn't actually having that impact. And then finally, the last of the five characters was volatility. Now, anxieties over specific threats, rock music, video games, comic books, people eating Tide Pods, horrifying clowns in the fall of 2016. There may be people who are anxious about them all the time, but oftentimes moral panics gain a lot of attention in a very specific, very short amount of time. They kind of pop up. And that kind of thing you can't hold on to the national attention that long. It's especially characteristic now with social media and how trends move very, very quickly, and something that would have lasted maybe a couple of weeks, maybe last a couple of days or even a couple of hours. So the moral entrepreneurs are able to kind of grab the national attention in very short, very concentrated ways. Now, the moral panic can then break down, and this is where it shows volatility, is that it could break down from a number of reasons. One, greater attention to it may give a chance for other competing voices to begin to contest the consensus, or moral entrepreneurs within the panic itself may begin to fracture, and they may begin to focus on specific aspects of that, or the national attention may just shift to something about that. Or the attention might shift somewhere else. Maybe another panic or a bigger issue comes up. I'll give you a couple of examples of some. One specifically that jumps in mind. This isn't quite a moral panic, but it'll give you kind of a sense of this kind of volatility. This definitely dates me. For those of you who were around in the summer of 2001, does everyone remember what the big media issue was in the summer of 2001? Give a second. Brief periods of hysteria is a good way of describing them. So they're fervor, but they can't last long. So, for those of you who were not around, or maybe had attention on other issues, which we'll talk about in a second, in 2001, but there was a lot of press attention on something called the Summer of the Shark. So, from about, I'm going to get the dates wrong, from about June to about late August, early September, a lot of what the media was focusing on was shark attacks. There was one highly publicized shark attack that happened, I believe it was in July. And all the media, shark attacks. Watch out. Just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water, sharks are on the prowl. And there really wasn't a big rise in shark attacks. And shark attacks are usually not very... They're rare occurrences, so they were disproportionate. It was a disproportionate response, but you want to talk to people and get their attention and sell papers and get headings. Most everybody's seen Jaws or some kind of man-eating shark movie or TV show, so it got a lot of attention. But here's where we get into the volatility thing and this idea of maybe other issues shake out. Is that was the big news issue into the summer of 2001, Shark attack panics could add money. Shark Week was a big thing even then. And however, something happened in September of 2001 that shifted the attention away from sharks to a bigger issue. Maybe I want to guess. Maybe it happened on, I think it happened on the 11th of September. Well, you get what I mean. So these are our 5 characteristics: concern, hostility, consensus, disproportionality. Yes, that's where I was going for. 9/11 and volatility are characteristics of a moral panic. And so all of this is to set us up with some foundation for when we talk about the video game moral panic. But we've been talking a lot in abstracts. So I want to talk, actually, volatility, I'll talk for a second. And this is another thing I want to talk about with disproportionality in particular, is, like I said, oftentimes the threat doesn't do what they think it does. So, for example, like people becoming more violent by listening to rock music, for example. Is it possible that instances of violence are going up for some other reason? And it may have nothing to do. One might have nothing to do with the other. So the relationship between the folk devil and this supposedly larger threat may not exist. And you always have to ask the question, when there's big focus on a specific target, like rock music, like video games, is there really a threat? If so, what is the relationship between the target and the larger threat? What does the data actually say about that? And then there's this other issue of correlation versus causation. If two statistical things are both is there a relationship between these two statistical things? And I'll give you a couple of fun examples. So when we talk about correlation versus causation, I give all the credit to Tyler Vision, who does a website called Spurious Correlations, and you can check these out on your own. So, for example, he put together data that were completely unrelated and put them on graphs together to see that it looked like they were related. So, for example, that per capita cheese consumption between 2000 and 2010 corresponds with the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Or that the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool has an interesting correlation between the films Nicolas Cage appeared in. Or, one of my favorites, letters in the winning word of the Scripps National Spelling Bee and its correlation with number of people killed by venomous spiders. My goodness, we need to get rid of the spelling bee. It will save us from spiders. Let us join the fight to end the spelling bee. How do you spell time's up spelling bee? Something must be done about Nicolas Cage and those people who are drowning in pools, possibly while watching Trespass. So this is all to say that a panic over a specific threat to the moral order may not have any correlation with real life figures. So why don't we talk about some specific examples here? So youth culture is a very, very common topic of moral panics. Someone needs to protect those young, vulnerable, impressionable children. It's easy to focus on youth culture for a number of different reasons. So there's that concern with stuff that kids do away from parents, and parents having this concern about who is having an adverse influence on their children, who's corrupting those impressionable young minds. They're like sponges at that age. So common targets of moral panics are things like movies, music. Rock music has been a very common topic of moral panic since dating back to the 1950s. Movies, the same thing, too. There was a very fascinating study that came out in the 1930s called Our Movie Made Children, which focused on interviews with teenagers and trying to examine a correlation between movie viewing and delinquency and crime. So this is not a new thing. TV shows, comics. Comic books are a common one. I'm going to talk briefly about comics in a little while. And just generally the stuff kids do away from their parents. Games, one of them, hence the reason why this whole series. So the kinds of impacts that those things have on children range from things like delinquency and crime. Or, for example, are people going to the movies or people going to arcades? Are they doing so at the expense of their schoolwork? Are they ducking out of school? For those kids who are going to get quarters, are they robbing people to get those quarters? If they're reading comic books, are they seeing crimes done in comics or on a TV show? And then carrying out those things. If I'm playing this in Mortal Kombat and I'm playing Sub-Zero and I rip out Liu Kang's spine, does that mean that me, being the impressionable young person that I am, that I'm going to run out to Billy on the playground and just do the same thing to him? Billy, poor Billy loses. I win. Fatality. Are you going to carry out those kinds of things? And is there a connection between, say, depictions of violence and real violence? Beyond that, there's also things like moral decay. Pardon the sound of my rustling papers. I am an academic. General moral decay. Are they corrupting these young minds? Are movies making our kids disobedient to their parents? One for Billy. Are movies making our kids more disobedient to their parents? Is rock music making young people want to have that promiscuous underage sex that'll lead to teen pregnancy and disease? Are they turning away from God by watching those satanic TV shows? Things like Charmed. Remember Charmed? They're learning about witchcraft, and they are going to be they're not going to be good upstanding Christians. And beyond that they're causing some level of physiological or psychological harm. Things like, for example, the thought maybe rock music is leading our kids down a dark path of alcohol and drugs. That maybe things like emotional music or TV shows that maybe have depictions of suicide, that it might be glorifying suicide and maybe making our kids want to commit those acts or enact things like self-harm. And so this idea that there's some kind of physiological effect on our youth, and it's always just this, oh my God, what are these kids doing today? And so we're going to show some examples of them. I thought we would do a case study. This one's a great example. Doctor Who as well. Oh, that was a good example. But my favorite example to talk about moral panics, aside from video games, since the reason we're here, is to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. And show of hands, anybody among our viewers right now is a D&D player. Anyway, whatever alignment you are, I assume that you all know what Dungeons and Dragons is. It's a tabletop role-playing game. You assume the role of fantasy characters, barbarians, wizards, and the sorcerers. And it's funny, I play Dungeons and Dragons enough, and you can't name 3 of them off the top of my head. What's wrong with me? Anyway, so we all know D&D. So during the 1980s, there was a moral backlash against D&D and D&D playing. There were kind of 2 parts of it. On the one hand was this concern that Dungeons and Dragons was targeting intelligent but impressionable young people, particularly boys, and that it was causing a break between fantasy and reality. And then on the other side of it was also causing people somehow to lead into suicide. There were a couple of there were a couple of cases that weren't really confirmed if this is the cause of it or not. It probably wasn't, but um, and then there was the other part of it, which particularly became popular beginning in the about 1982. So first, I'll start before I go into that. So an example of this idea that Dungeons and Dragons are causing this terrible break from reality. The most famous example of that is the 1982 film Mazes and Monsters. If you're interested in moral panics, if you're interested in the history of gaming, if you're interested in depictions of media and gaming, especially when much of mainstream popular culture didn't know what D&D was, watch Mazes and Monsters is easy enough to find online. And if that isn't enough, watch it because it is the earliest role of Tom Hanks in a movie. And so you can see very, very young Tom Hanks assuming the role of a guy who plays a D&D adjacent game who eventually has this sort of psychological break from reality and can no longer tell the difference between fantasy and reality, which also does eventually lead to him committing a violent act. And there was fear that people would have this break from reality and not know where the game ended and reality began. It might lead to something like a violent murder. And then there was this part of it. So the other part is that Dungeons and Dragons is leading people into the occult, that it's going to make people into Satanists. Um, and this is actually part of a larger panic um, about the occult and Satanism in the 1980s. I'll talk about that in a second. But this part of it got traction beginning in 1982 from a woman named Patricia Pulling. So on June the 9th, 1982, Pulling and her husband came back to their Montpelier, Virginia home to find their teenage son, Irving Jr., went by the nickname of Bink, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Bink had apparently committed suicide. And so Pulling tried to find some kind of explanation why he did this. And eventually she settled on Dungeons and Dragons. She found out that he had played the game at some point. It's not clear how much he actually played, going aside. But she discovered, quote unquote, discovered, and I'll talk about it in a second, that she believed that his suicide was a result of what that someone put a death curse on him, on his character, and that somehow that he carried out that act in real life. And so she became a one-woman army against Dungeons and Dragons. She formed an organization called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, or BAD, and basically set out to warn the world about the dangers of Dungeons and Dragons. She set herself up as a self-proclaimed occult expert. She identified herself as a private investigator and basically made herself into an expert on quote-unquote occult crimes, and basically presented herself as this expert. And she crafted this elaborate narrative of a vast occult conspiracy that was going on underneath all of our noses, and that these nefarious forces were, setting aside Christianity and leading into the Dark Lord's arrival. Not quite that extreme, but like this idea that they were becoming a cult, and that the introduction to the cult was leading to violence and suicide and self-harm, as she thought in her son Bink. Now, according to accounts from people who knew Bink, he had a history of emotional issues, and it's possible that his suicide was a result of other factors. One suggested that it might have been frustrations at home. Apparently both Pat and Irving Sr. were involved in numerous extramarital affairs, and that he came off from from his people around him as kind of troubled, and that might have been going through something that his parents weren't aware of. Um, so that being said, that did not deter Pat Pulling. And she partnered with watchdog organizations, one of the big ones, National Coalition on Television Violence, or NCTV. Remember that in the back of your mind. We're eventually going to go back to NCTV. Um, and they tried to launch a campaign to get TSR, the creators and distributors of Dungeons and Dragons, to be required by the Federal Trade Commission to have a warning on all of their packaging saying that it was connected to acts of violence and self-harm. So here is some of the line of reasoning that was in the arguments of people like Pat Pulling. So Pat Pulling published a book called The Devil's Web, Who is Selling Your Children to Satan, or something along those lines for the postscript. Here's kind of her line of reasoning going from introductions to the occult through things like Dungeons and Dragons, which eventually leading into violence and terrible crimes. So this is a quote, exact quote from her book. And let's see if we can't follow her logic. The child who is obsessed with occult entertainment may stop there, but he often moves on to satanic graffiti and cemetery vandalism. From that point, he easily moves on to grave robbing for items needed for occult rituals, and he is just a step away from bloodletting. Bloodletting begins with animal killings and mutilations and progresses to murder if an intervention does not take place. So watch out, boys and girls. When you start rolling those D6s to build your character, you may lead yourself on a dark path that leads you to go into graveyards in the middle of the night to desecrate gravestones and dig bodies up and try to resurrect the dead and then murder people and then resurrect those bodies and just on and on and on and on. So this got media attention during from about the mid 1980s into the 1990s. Did they progress the leeches after? That's an excellent question. I don't see why not. Are they satanic leeches? Because they would probably have to be. So there are lots of issues to unpack with Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. She Pulling writes in her book that she supposedly learned about the game and actually how the game worked by, this is from her account, wandering onto a college campus. I believe it was Virginia Tech, but it's been a while since I read the book. And basically accosting a bunch of college students and asking them to have her come in on a D&D session. And then she claimed she played for a little while, although it's very hard to believe her accounts, especially because her book, in terms of what D&D is loaded with factual inaccuracies. She was convinced that the dungeon master, whose role is, to actually guide the campaign and everything, she thought of the dungeon master as this all-powerful like cult leader. It's like, you rolled this way, you have to do this in real life kind of thing. And that leads into one of the other people who talked about this. This is a pretty famous panel from Jack Chick. Jack Chick again, called Dark Dungeons. If you know anything about the D&D panic, you probably know about this comic, which follows a young girl who advances in levels high enough in D&D to practice real magic. And then eventually finds that someone amongst this coven has been led to suicide. And then eventually, she finds Jesus and she's fine and safe, although the other person is dead. So this is kind of the prototypical example of a moral panic, because if we go piece by piece into our analysis of moral panics, let's go to our 5 pieces again. We've got concern, definitely concern, anxieties over what children are up to when parents are not around. We've certainly got our hostility, that this is a very dangerous threat to the point that advocates like Pulling wanted to get the Federal Trade Commission involved. We have a consensus among these specific people talking about this, that Dungeons and Dragons leads to violence, that it leads to disconnection from reality. Another thing that's interesting about that too, was she at a Ouija board by accident? That's an excellent question too. We'll get into those later on. What's also interesting about the D&D campaign is that they took on a conspiracy tone, speaking of consensus, in the sense that anybody who offered competing information the advocates of this, like pulling, like Chick, saw the people who criticized them as in on it. There was a report later on by a guy named oh, I forgot the name. I'll look it up and I'll put it in the next episode. Wrote a thing called the Polling Report, in which he refuted all of her claims and examined her inaccuracies. There were police investigators and people who worked with the FBI who basically refuted their claims as self-proclaimed experts in the occult. And the response from people who advocated for this particular idea of Dungeons and Dragons is that those people must be in on it. They're with the Dark Lord too. They have dungeon masters, or they are dungeon masters, and they're putting death curses on people. So don't listen to them. Listen to our consensus. And disproportionality. Thank you for viewing. I'll have the rest of it on later. So disproportionality. There was no evidence that this ever existed. All the connections, the alleged connections between suicide and Dungeons and Dragons, where there were cases, were usually more easily explainable by other things. For example, histories of mental illness and things like that. And this was also volatile. It didn't last terribly long, this particular panic on it. Now, there's still anxieties that are in certain circles about D&D like this, but it never really captured that attention the way it is. And also the other thing is that now more people play D&D, and it's more widely acceptable as a media. So that's our case study about, this is going to lead us to understand video games. So here's some other examples of moral panics. We've got the comic book panic of the 1950s, put in motion in particular by a psychologist named Frederick Wertham, who wrote a book in 1954 called The Seduction of the Innocent, which focused on a variety of anxieties related to comic books and how they would corrupt the youth, things like connections to violence and murder and things like that, and stuff we've heard before in some of these other ones. The heavy metal panic of the 1980s, which went alongside and actually sometimes operated parallel to the panic over D&D, because some of the same circles rolled in both of them, especially with concerns over the relationship between heavy metal and the occult. For example, one of the people who had an endorsement on the back of Pulling's book was Tipper Gore, who later wrote a book called Raising PG Kids in an X-Rated Society. And Tipper Gore's big target was heavy metal music, and concerns about heavy metal being connected to the occult and violence and unusual sexuality and promiscuity and all that stuff. And another in the 1980s, gosh, the 1980s were busy for these things, was the alleged crack baby panic of the 1980s. A lot of media concern about crack cocaine and its impact, particularly that pregnant mothers who take crack and crack cocaine would pass on their addiction to their children, and the crack baby became a very common staple of advocates for increased regulation of drugs and increased criminalization of people with dealing in drugs and taking them. And what's these have in common, as with other moral panics, is that, again, the advocates are trying to get something done about it, some kind of measure in either regulation, restriction. And so there was a very fascinating congressional hearing that came out of Tipper Gore's things, in which, if you ever could find it, among the people who testified in favor of music, the music industry, were Dee Snider of Twisted Sister and Frank Zappa. And they're very fascinating to hear from. But calls for regulation and restriction were common with these things. Like I said, in D&D, there was this idea they wanted to put warning labels on them through the Federal Trade Commission. The comic book panic led to a creation of the comics industry called the Comics Code Authority, which had strict content restrictions. One of the reasons superhero comics became popular in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and all that is because other kinds of comics like true crime comics and horror comics were heavily restricted by the Comics Code, and it became safer to target comics specifically at children with childhood characters, and who gained ascendancy from that were superheroes. So you can thank In some ways, you can thank the Marvel Cinematic Universe on this comic book panic in the 1950s. And calls for restrictions also were in music. In 1990 was the introduction of the parental advisory label, which focused on things like explicit content, which came out of these conversations in the 1980s about what was rock music doing to our poor impressionable children. And the crack baby panic in particular called for more tough on crime, tough on drugs measures. You've maybe seen some of the PSAs of just say no and a hardline stance on drugs. The other part, and this is the insidious element of some of these moral panics, is that all moral panics have some kind of othering that's involved in them. They create these folk devils and people associated with them. So, for example, in D&D, the Dungeon Master, as an example of a person who epitomizes all these things that needs to be brought to heel. Violent video games, which we'll talk about in more detail in later episodes, those horrible, greedy video game publishers who are exploiting our children for profit, which also came in the comics thing as well. This can have really insidious implications too, particularly because it can offer demonization of certain groups, and this has particularly been bad for marginalized groups, people of varying immigration status, people of particularly non-white races. The crack baby panic specifically targeted Black women as being, bad, unfit mothers, and the sort of demonization of mothers, particularly overwhelmingly targeting African Americans. Panics over intrusion over immigrants. There's lots of racial coding that can come into these panics, and they can have these really insidious overtones like that. And so these are things to think about with moral panics. What's also interesting about moral panics is they're often cyclical, and different targets of panics will kind of come back. And what's funny is oftentimes they'll make previous things that were targets of panics acceptable. I'll give you an example. The heavy metal music panic is a great example of this because some of the people who were complaining about where music was were like, why can't we get back to the days of Elvis and more wholesome music? When in the 1950s, they were saying a lot of the similar things about rock and roll music then that was causing, delinquency and loose morals and all that stuff. And so what often happens is that sometimes it'll make previous ones accepted. And we'll actually see that in video games when we get to talking about video games. And oftentimes what happens is generational, because what happens is those people who grew up in that stuff become the establishment, and they become, the man, and they begin to target, they can become anxious about what is this current group of children doing when they were doing the similar things at their age. There's that line from Bye Bye Birdie. It says, why can't they be like we were? And I'll just go really briefly into recent panics because this still happens now, and we'll see some of this stuff. I mentioned Tide Pods a while ago, and sort of the disproportionate response about Tide Pods back in 2018. My dear Lord in heaven, 2020 has been the longest decade of my life. That we were talking about this in 2018. There was a before coronavirus. We were talking about this stuff. Someone asked if there are still moral panics about rap. That's a good question. I have not done enough research on rap music to say, but they were definitely talking about it in the 1990s. There hasn't been a big concerted one as far as I know, but some other recent ones is things like the knockout game. It was supposedly this game where people were going around and just sucker punching someone and seeing if they could knock someone out in one hit. And then there was the choking game. The choking game kind of comes up every decade or so. This particular article I have is from 2005, but when I was researching this, I found another panic over the choking game in 2014. And as I recall, at least where I am in Philadelphia, there was a panic over the knockout game actually a couple of years before that in 2013, I think. And then there's this one. These aren't moral panics per se, but this idea of sort of media panics. The creepy clown craze which is very hard to say. I had to say it very slowly. This idea that people in horrifying clown costumes were going around in October of 2016. And all of them have these questions about, are they real panics? Were people really eating Tide Pods and poisoning themselves? Are people really going around and punching people till they knock them out? Are people choking themselves till they pass out and die and things like that? And all of them had some aspect of something needs to be done. We don't know what, but it's got to be done. It's got to be fixed somehow. And all of them were volatile. This is probably for many of you the first time you've thought about the scary clown panic since, say, November of 2016. And we talk about volatility. We saw what happened in November of 2016 that maybe got people thinking about something else. So let's recap. We've gone a little longer than I expected, but so as I said at the beginning, the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, the ratings for video games, was the product of a moral panic, like these ones we talked about, like D&D, like rock music. It was a product of a moral panic against video games in 1993. We talked about what a moral panic is. It's a sudden backlash against perceived threat to the moral order, but the general impact of that is usually overstated or non-existent. And it's waged by people called moral entrepreneurs, people like lawmakers and religious leaders and educators, members of the media who call attention to this issue and offer demands for solutions for that. You do things like regulation, censorship, things like that, curtailing certain behaviors. And that youth culture is a common folk devil. It's a common target of moral panic. And that things like heavy metal music and film and television and those things that kids do when their parents are watching, oh my God, what are they doing? Can become the targets of these anxieties. That they can be the epitome of things like delinquency and moral decay, and in some cases, possibly actual physical harm or violence. The other thing I didn't touch on, which I'll touch on now, is that this kind of goes with volatility, is that moral panics often say a lot more about a specific period or moment in time than what they're actually calling for. And things like the Dungeons and Dragons panic are more interesting in a larger context because there were other anxieties going on in the 1980s. There was concerns about the role of government, concerns over crime, concerns over economic decay, concerns over the Cold War. In fact, another great example of this is the comic panic that I mentioned may have more to do with Cold War anxieties in the 1950s, the paranoia. We talk about things like McCarthyism, this idea of are there insidious elements that are being inserted into our society that are trying to undermine it from within, which was a large target of concern during the 1950s with the advent of the Cold War. And this just goes without saying, this is your public service announcement. Don't eat Tide Pods. It will not make you cool. You will not make friends eating Tide Pods. So are there any questions? West Phillies, you had a great question again about rap music. I wish I had a better answer. Again, I do know that there was some concerns over rap music, and actually they will parallel concerns about video games in 1993 because it kind of happened around the same time. But I'm not sure if there had there been any major moral panics recently. I would definitely search it, and I'll definitely do my homework between now and next week. But any other questions while we have the time? Do moral panics coincide more with times of unrest or times of relative stability? That's a really, really good question. I suppose it depends. I would say, just as an anecdotal observation, I'm noticing not a lot of talk about moral panics right now during coronavirus. And like I said, that whole panic in the summer of 2001, there was a lot of anxiety, or at least pressed in the media, about shark attacks, and conversations about that went away with 9/11 because that became the focal point. My gut would say that it's more when I guess not a lot is going on. Because one thing that often sometimes coincides with these focus on panics, particularly things like Tide Pod Challenge and the like the knockout games, they often come around when there's like not a lot of, I guess, kind of slow news periods or what the media's not really focusing on. But that's a really really good question. I mean, the 1950s had a kind of apocalyptic anxiety over things like the Cold War, and things like nuclear proliferation, which became even more of a concern after the Soviet Union got the bomb in 1950. So I think it largely depends on what's going on around, and what targets are, and what's the larger context. Again, really really good question. Any other questions? All right. So for those of you who got here late, fear not, because I will have the full recording of this on my YouTube channel, so you can feel free to subscribe. I'm also going to put it on my website. I'm going to the link to my website, which is a full overview of the series, is down in the description too. But the short version is these are the next episodes we're going to be covering. Next week, we're actually going to get more into video games, focusing specifically on what video game panics were before 1993. What were the targets of concerns regard to video games before this moral panic we're going to talk about? Then the next three episodes, we'll talk about some of the larger trends going on, both in the American body politic and in the video game industry. And we're going to learn about some stuff like virtual reality and the first VR craze. We're going to talk about full motion video games and Laserdisc games. And then we're going to talk about a panic over violent crime that also happened and had a profound influence on why we have ratings in video games now. Then part 6, we're going to talk about some of the key targets. If you heard anything about the creation of the ESRB, chances are you've heard about these two games, Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. I've heard Night Trap is on sale on the Switch now. It's up to you if you want to play it. I'm not going to play it. And Mortal Kombat, and we'll talk about the impact of Mortal Kombat and Night Trap at the time. Then we'll actually go into the congressional hearings, and then we'll end things with talking about what was the point of all this, what was the legacy of the Panic of the ESRB. So I hope you'll tune in for those later episodes. They will be from, you can follow the series. Like I said on my website, links in the description. You can follow me on Twitter at KD Impellizeri. That is KDIMPELLIZERI. I've had a lot of time to practice that. And you can follow me at YouTube, subscribe at Doctimus. And I did mean to say this at the beginning. I apologize for not saying this in the outset. The impetus for this entire series was a series that game historian Lane Nooney at NYU is doing, called Computer History in the Age of Social Distancing, a lecture series. Their series is what inspired me to do this, so I definitely recommend checking it out. It's really good, and I put a link in the description of how to go see that. But I hope that you will all be here next week when we'll be covering at the same time, Friday, April 17th, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. I'll be live streaming part 2, where we'll talk about video game panics before 1993. Again, thank you all for checking in, and I hope that you'll tune in for the next episodes. So be safe out there, stay inside, wash your hands, maintain that social distancing, all those things you've been told, and be sure to take care of yourself too, because social distancing is important, but emotional connections are just as important now as they've ever been, if not more so. But otherwise, thank you again. Thank you so much for your time. Stay safe out there. Take care.